Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The recycled air on Verath Station tasted like compromise. Eli Voss had been breathing it for 3 days and had come to think of it as appropriate, slightly stale, faintly metallic, and produced by a system that was technically functioning but clearly not enjoying itself. He sat at the long obsidian negotiating table of the Grand Conclave chamber and stared at a holographic trade chart that had stopped meaning anything to him sometime around hour 39, and he thought about coffee. Real coffee. The kind that existed on Earth, in gravity that knew what it was doing, in a kitchen that smelled like something other than filtered consensus. Around him, the galaxy was conducting its most elaborate performance of pretending to cooperate. The Dorathi delegation occupied the arc to his left, 6 tall figures with amber-tinted exoskeletons, and the unsettling habit of tilting their upper segments forward when they were interested in something, which meant that, during particularly contentious discussions, the entire group would slowly lean toward the speaker like a row of very large, very attentive plants tracking a dim sun. They communicated partially through scent. The station's chemical analysis system had been quietly logging their emissions all morning, and had so far identified traces of what it classified as ceremonial displeasure, competitive interest, and something it listed, with apparent uncertainty, as the olfactory equivalent of an eyebrow raise. Eli had found this report more useful than anything produced by the formal proceedings. To his right, the 3 representatives of the Moon Collective sat in the particular stillness that had initially led the station's automated security system to flag them as decorative. They had not moved perceptibly since the session opened. One of them had, at some point in the previous hour, blinked. Eli had caught it peripherally and felt, unreasonably, that he had witnessed something significant. 43 delegations in total. 43 species, 43 sets of protocols, 43 definitions of the word negotiation, arranged in a rough ellipse around a chamber that had been designed to communicate neutrality through architecture, and had mostly succeeded in communicating the particular anxiety of a room that was trying very hard. The translation drones drifted overhead in their slow orbital patterns, each one processing somewhere between 4 and 9 languages simultaneously, occasionally emitting a soft chime that meant they had encountered a concept with no adequate equivalent and were doing their best. They chimed a lot. Eli had started thinking of it as ambient music. He had been the lead negotiator for the human delegation for 11 years. Before that, 7 years as a secondary attaché, and before that, a brief and instructive period as a junior observer on a minor trade summit that had collapsed on its 4th day, when 2 delegations realized they had been accidentally negotiating in metaphor for the entire preceding week, and had reached an agreement neither of them had intended. He was 51 years old, spoke 4 languages fluently and 2 more adequately, and carried the specific variety of patience that develops not from a naturally calm temperament, but from having lost that temperament completely several times in professional contexts, and having decided to rebuild it more deliberately. He had good instincts. He trusted them the way you trust a compass you've dropped twice, carefully, and always with one eye on the landscape. It was his instincts that registered her first, before his conscious attention did. She was standing at the eastern gallery, perhaps 60 meters across the chamber, partially obscured by the drifting path of a translation drone and the slow movement of what appeared to be the Theresi cultural attaché conducting a private argument with a piece of his own delegation's documentation. She was watching the human table, not scanning the room, not observing the proceedings, watching the table. Specifically, and with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had not arrived at that position by accident. She looked, at first approximation, like a human woman. This assessment lasted about 4 seconds before it began to quietly revise itself. She was the right general configuration, upright, bilateral, the face arranged in the conventional way that Eli had come to understand, was less a sign of kinship than of the universe's limited imagination regarding functional anatomy. But her skin held something underneath its surface tone, a structural iridescence that moved when she moved, not glowing, not dramatic, simply present the way certain minerals are present in stone, a quality that only becomes visible at the right angle and then cannot be unseen. Her eyes, even at this distance, were wrong in a way he could not immediately specify. Large, very dark, something at the edge of them that caught the chamber light differently than it should. He looked at her for 4 seconds. Then the Dorathi second minister accused the Moon Collective of violating a boundary clause, using a legal argument so structurally ambitious that 2 translation drones simultaneously entered reboot cycles. And Eli looked away, because he was a professional. But when the session ended, she was still there, and she was still watching. The silence on Verath Station was the wrong kind. Saraval had noticed this within the first hour of arrival and had not stopped noticing it since. The station's environmental systems maintained what the hospitality documentation had described, with evident pride, as a carefully calibrated acoustic neutrality, which meant that the ambient sound in her delegation's quarters was not loud and not absent but simply flat, uniform, a silence with no texture, no variation, no information carried in it at all. On the Velthari homeworld, silence was a living thing. It had depth and direction. It told you where you were in a room, what the walls were made of, how far away the ceiling was, whether it was morning or deep night. The silence on Verath Station told you nothing except that the ventilation system was operating within normal parameters, which was, Saraval had decided, the loneliest fact she had ever been informed of by an atmosphere. She sat at the low desk in her private room and read the briefing document for the 11th time. Not the whole document. She had read the whole document so many times that she had developed opinions about its paragraph breaks. She was reading the appendices. Specifically, the secondary appendix to the 3rd supplementary attachment, which contained the xenobiological subreport that her government's review board had classified as theoretical low confidence, pending further data. The report was authored by a researcher named Thavil, who wrote in the precise, slightly defensive style of someone who had excellent instincts and spent a great deal of professional energy apologizing for them. Thavil's central proposition, buried in language so carefully hedged it had taken Saraval 3 readings to locate the actual claim beneath the qualifications, was that humans produced bioelectric fields as a byproduct of standard neurological function, and that these fields operated at frequencies that might, under conditions not yet fully specified, interact in unpredictable ways with Velthari neurochemistry if had been italicized, which in scientific documentation of this kind functioned as a formal disclaimer. Direct dermal contact were to occur. There was a footnote to this footnote. It cited one incident, a Velthari scout vessel, a human mining crew, an interaction classified as inconclusive and filed, apparently, in the section of the archive where things went when no one wanted to decide what they meant. Saraval closed the document and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she opened the handshake simulation. It was, by any reasonable standard, a thorough simulation. Her cultural liaison IRV had sourced it from a database of human diplomatic protocol training materials, and had spent 2 days adapting it for her use, a process he had undertaken with the professional dedication of a man who had committed to a task, and the personal expression of a man who was genuinely unsure how he had arrived at this point in his career. The simulation presented a holographic human hand at the correct height and angle. A quiet voice, rendered in Velthari, talked her through the mechanics, the extension of the right hand, the clasping of the other party's hand at a grip pressure described as firm but not aggressive, a distinction that the simulation measured in units, and that Saraval had been hitting consistently for the past 40 minutes. The duration was the difficult part, 3 to 5 seconds. Not 2 was abrupt, An abruptness in a greeting gesture communicated, depending on context, either disrespect or an urgent need to be elsewhere. Not six. Six shaded into something the training materials described as uncomfortably prolonged, a phrase that Saraval found she had thoughts about, given that the entire custom already qualified as uncomfortably prolonged by her own cultural baseline. 3 to 5 seconds of voluntary, sustained physical contact with a stranger, with the apparent communicative function of, she had checked this 3 times across separate sources, demonstrating mutual goodwill and establishing the beginning of a professional relationship. She had also read that historically the gesture had involved testing whether the other person was carrying a weapon in their right hand, which she found significantly more logical, and which made her feel somewhat better about the whole enterprise. Irv knocked and entered without waiting, which was his custom and which she had long since stopped addressing. He looked at the simulation. He looked at her. His expression was that of a man exercising significant professional restraint. Again. He said, "The release timing," she said. "I keep going to 4.8. He sat down in the chair near the door with the slow movement of a person settling in for something. "The human negotiator will not be timing you. I will know." "Ambassador," he paused. "At some point the simulation ends and the actual room begins." She closed the simulation. She looked at him for a moment with the particular stillness that senior Velthari diplomats developed over years of practice, and that junior staff consistently found more difficult to sit with than any expression of open displeasure. "I am aware of what room I am walking into tomorrow morning," she said. "I am also aware of what my government requires from that room. I intend to be prepared." Irv said nothing. He had worked with her for 6 years, and had learned to identify the specific quality of her silences, this one being the silence that meant the conversation had ended, but he was not yet dismissed. "The footnote," she said after a moment. "The Thavil footnote," he said, not a question. "It is classified low confidence." "It is," he agreed. She looked at the desk where the document had been. Thavil italicized the "if," she said. Irv appeared to consider several responses. "That is what italics are for," he offered finally. She dismissed him. She sat alone in the textureless silence of the station for a long time, reading nothing, running no simulations, simply sitting with the weight of what her empire needed and the particular discipline required to walk toward something uncertain with the appearance, at least, of absolute purpose. In the morning, she crossed the chamber. She crossed the chamber with the stride of someone who had made a decision and was living inside it fully, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. The grand conclave chamber on the morning of the 3rd day was operating at its particular peak density of organized confusion. The Dorathi delegation had arrived early and were already emitting what the station's chemical analysis system would later log as anticipatory formality with traces of territorial confidence, a combination that smelled, to the 2 human staffers seated nearest to them, vaguely like a hardware store. The Moon Collective had not moved since the previous evening, or possibly since the summit began. No one had been able to establish a baseline. Translation drones crossed overhead in their slow rotations, chiming softly at intervals, processing the 17 simultaneous conversations happening in the chamber's outer corridors, and doing their patient, uncelebrated best with concepts that did not translate so much as approximate. Saraval moved through all of it with the unhurried precision of someone who had studied the chamber's traffic patterns in advance, which she had. She had identified the optimal path from the Velthari delegation's arc to the human table the previous evening, mapping it against the standard movement data from the first 2 days of the summit, accounting for the Theresi cultural attaché, who had developed a habit of conducting private consultations near the eastern column, and who moved unpredictably and at length. She had a clear route. She had her opening statement. She had her handshake timing calibrated to 4 seconds, which was the median of the acceptable range, and therefore the diplomatically safest choice, which was the kind of reasoning that had served her well for 20 years, and which she was currently using to avoid thinking about the Thavo footnote. Eli saw her coming when she was approximately 30 meters out. He had good instincts, and she was not hiding her approach. She was, in fact, moving with such deliberate purpose that the Dorathi second minister paused mid-sentence to track her path and then leaned slightly forward, which his colleagues mirrored automatically, so that by the time she reached the human table, there was a row of large amber figures tilted toward her with the collective attention of creatures who recognized purposeful motion and respected it. Eli stood. This was protocol, and he was good at protocol, and also he had been watching her since the previous day and had the instinct of someone who understood that what was walking toward him was not routine. She arrived. The translation drone assigned to the human delegation drifted into position between them with the quiet efficiency of long practice. Her expression was composed. Her posture was the posture of a person who had prepared for this moment, until preparation became a form of architecture, something you stood inside rather than something you did. Her right hand extended at the correct angle and height, smooth and unhesitating, and her mouth open to begin the opening statement she had constructed and refined and rehearsed until the words had the worn smooth quality of something handled many times. He took her hand. The opening statement did not happen. What happened instead was that Saraval's entire nervous system received, simultaneously and without any warning that the Thavo footnote had adequately prepared her for, a signal it had no architecture to process. It was not pain. It was not pleasure. It was both of those things happening at the same time in a brain that had a very clear opinion about the difference and was now discovering, at volume, that the opinion was insufficient. Every sensory receptor she had was receiving input at a frequency that her evolutionary history had simply not included, and the result was less like an injury and more like every piece of information she had ever processed arriving again, all at once, in a language she recognized but could not currently read. Her voluntary motor system, faced with this situation, made the only reasonable decision available to it. It stopped, not gradually, not partially, completely, immediately, and with the commitment of a system that had assessed the situation and concluded that the correct response was to cease taking requests until further notice. She could not move her hand. She could not move any part of herself. She was standing in the grand conclave chamber of Verath Station, her hand locked in the grip of the human lead negotiator, her mouth still open at the beginning of a sentence that was not going to finish, her expression frozen at the precise moment her nervous system had decided to stop accepting input from her conscious intentions. She was, in every neurological sense, entirely present. She could observe with perfect clarity what was happening. She simply could not do anything about it, which was, she reflected in the small part of her consciousness that was still operating normally and would later be responsible for the bulk of her professional humiliation, a genuinely extraordinary level of biological betrayal. Eli stood and held the hand of the Velthari ambassador and understood in approximately 2 seconds that something had gone very wrong. She was not moving. She was not speaking. Her eyes were open and tracking and clearly occupied by a functioning consciousness, but her body was stopped, completely and rigidly stopped, in the way that suggested this was not a social choice. He did not drop her hand because 16 separate diplomatic etiquette guides had opinions about mid-greeting hand withdrawal, and his instincts were screaming at him to be careful. So they stood, together, holding hands in the middle of the chamber. The translation drone hummed between them, faithfully prepared to translate whatever happened next, experiencing perhaps the most anticlimactic deployment of its professional capabilities since the Moon Collective's second session, during which nothing had occurred for 4 hours. 43 delegations noticed at slightly different moments, in the way a room wakes up. Her aides arrived at a speed that answered, definitively, the question of whether they had been watching closely. Two of them, moving with the specific urgency of people who had been hoping something would not happen, and were now managing it happening. The senior aide, a young Velthari named Sarev whose composure had been excellent until this moment, and was now operating under significant strain, addressed Eli directly through a second translation drone in a rapid, low-voiced explanation that required the drone to work hard and chime twice. The bioelectric interaction, the neural cascade, the theoretical footnote that was no longer theoretical, the recommendation, gentle, urgent, that he release her hand, with the caveat that this would help but would not fully resolve the effects, which had already propagated and would require several hours to clear. Eli released her hand. Saraval's motor system, receiving the reduction in input, began the slow process of renegotiating with her body. She could move, technically, in the way that a translation drone chiming on a concept it cannot fully render is technically communicating. Her first step, assisted by Sarev's careful steadying hand, had the quality of a person navigating a floor that might or might not be there. The catering bot that had been circling the eastern column for 2 days drifted into the small clearing that had formed around them. It extended its service tray with the implacable hospitality of a machine that had one function and was committed to it. On the tray were 3 small pastries formatted for the Moon Collective, which no one else on the station could identify or had previously attempted to eat. Saraval's voluntary override systems were not yet fully operational. She took one. She ate it. It was deeply strange. Under any normal circumstances, she would not have done this. These were not normal circumstances, and her body was currently making its own decisions. So she ate the pastry, and it was fine, and Sarev watched this happen with the expression of someone filing it away to process later when there was time. She was escorted from the chamber. Behind her, the 43 delegations returned, slowly and with varying degrees of discretion, to the business of the summit. The Dorathi second minister resumed his argument. The translation drones resumed their rotations. The Moon Collective had not reacted to any of it, which was either diplomatic professionalism of the highest order or confirmation that they had been decorative the entire time. Eli sat back down at the human table. His deputy, a sharp-eyed woman named Yara who had been with the delegation for 4 years and had seen a great deal, leaned toward him and said very quietly, "That's a new one." "Yes," he said. "Do we know what happened?" He looked at the door through which Saraval had been carefully walked. "We do now," he said. The small meeting room that Eli had requisitioned under Diplomatic Protocol Provision 7 was doing its best. The station's hospitality system had interpreted the request for a private facilitated discussion as an opportunity to demonstrate its full range of atmospheric capabilities, and had responded by setting the lighting to something it apparently classified as reconciliatory warm, arranging 2 chairs at a table of precisely neutral dimensions, and placing on that table a small collection of decorative objects chosen, according to the room's configuration log, for their cross-cultural ambiguity. There was a sphere of hammered silver. There was something that might have been a vase or might have been a measuring instrument, depending on who had made it and why. There was a small sculpture that the inventory system had labeled decorative item, provenance unknown, do not discard, which Eli felt was the most honest description of anything he had encountered on the station. He arrived 4 minutes after the agreed time, which was deliberate. He had learned, over 11 years, carefulness of someone who was back in full possession of their body, and was treating that possession with a new and specific respect, the way you treat a complicated piece of equipment after it has surprised you with an undocumented function. He set one of the cups in front of her without asking. She looked at it. She did not touch it immediately. He sat down, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the room's reconciliatory warm lighting did its quiet, unconvincing work around them. She spoke first. She said, through the translation drone they had both accepted as a permanent feature of whatever this conversation was going to be. that she owed him two things, an apology and an explanation, and that she intended to deliver both in that order, after which she would like, if he was willing, to have the conversation her government had sent her to Verath Station to have. Because the resource situation had not become less urgent in the 3 hours since she had been walked out of the Grand Conclave chamber by her aide, while carrying a pastry she could not identify. He said he was willing. He said he had one question first. She said that seemed fair. He asked whether the experience from her side had been as dramatic as it had appeared from his. The translation drone processed this. She looked at him for a long moment with those large dark eyes, the silver rim at their edges catching the light in its slow, almost imperceptible pulse. Then she said, with precision and without inflection, that it had been considerably more dramatic from her perspective, and that the closest analogy her translation system could offer for the sensation was standing inside a very large bell at the exact moment it is struck, except that the bell was also somehow posing questions that her nervous system was not equipped to answer and could not stop trying to. He considered this for a moment. He said that might be the strangest description of a handshake he had ever received, and that he had once spent 11 days negotiating fishing rights with a species that communicated exclusively through the controlled release of bioluminescent spores in patterns that changed meaning based on the negotiator's distance from the emitter. So the competition for that particular distinction was genuinely serious. Something shifted in her expression. It was small and it was careful and it was entirely genuine, not a smile in any architecture he fully recognized, but something adjacent to one, something in the same family, the way certain planets are in the same system without being the same world. A relaxation, a reclassification, the specific change that happens in a person's face when they have been braced for a conversation, and the conversation has turned out to be slightly different from what they braced for. She picked up the cup. She held it the way he was holding his, not drinking, just holding. He noticed and did not comment on it, because he was, at his core, a person who understood which things to leave alone. She gave him the apology first. It was formal and specific and delivered in the careful register of someone who had composed it during 3 hours of neurological recovery and had not wasted the time. She had known about the theoretical risk, the Thavil footnote, the low-confidence classification, the italicized if, the single inconclusive incident in the archive that nobody had followed up on because the researcher had taken a sabbatical and the thread had gone cold. She had assessed the risk as acceptably low. She had been wrong, and she said so with the directness of someone who did not use qualifications as cushioning when the fact itself was plain. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he said that he appreciated it and meant it, and that, for what it was worth, the encounter had not been without its instructive aspects, because he now knew something about Velthari neurobiology that no human xenobiologist had confirmed before, which was the kind of data point that had a way of mattering later. She looked at him. She said that Thavil was going to be insufferable about this. He asked who Thavil was. She said the researcher who wrote the footnote. She said he had been on sabbatical for 2 years and had sent, in that time, 4 separate follow-up communications to her government's xenobiological division, asking whether anyone had gathered further data on the bioelectric interaction hypothesis, each one slightly more pointed than the last. She said that when the incident report reached him, and it would reach him, because these things always did, he would respond with the specific energy of a scientist who had italicized an if and been proven right, and that this energy was difficult to be around. Eli said that in his experience, the most dangerous person in any room was the one who had written a footnote nobody read. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that this was more true than he likely knew, in more context than xenobiology, and she said it with the weight of someone for whom it was not a general observation but a specific memory, and he recognized the weight and let it settle. Then she told him what her empire needed. She told him plainly, without the architecture of formal diplomatic language. not because she had abandoned the protocols, but because she had decided in those 3 hours that she had spent enough of this summit performing purpose and would prefer, in this room, to simply have it. The isotopes, the territorial adjacency, the supply chain fragility that her government had been managing for 2 years and could not manage for a third. She told him the shape of the problem and the shape of what she was asking, and she put her hands flat on the table while she did it, visible and still, and she watched him listen. He listened the way good negotiators listen, not constructing his response while she spoke, but actually receiving what she was saying and letting it settle before he began to think about it. It was a discipline, and she recognized it as one, and the recognition shifted something further in how she was reading him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the arrangement she was describing was possible. Not simple, and not without political complexity on his end, and not something that could be settled in this room on this day. But possible. He said the word like it was a foundation rather than a ceiling, and she understood the difference. Outside the small room, the summit continued its elaborate and exhausting performance. The Dorathi were almost certainly emitting something pointed. The Moon Collective were doing whatever the Moon Collective did, which remained, after 3 days, genuinely unclear. Somewhere on the station, a catering bot was circling a column with the peaceful commitment of a machine that had found its purpose and was not troubled by its limits. 4 more days. An arrangement that 2 civilizations needed, and that would require careful, unhurried work to build into something that would hold. 2 people sitting in a room with cups of something that was not coffee, having arrived at this table by a route that neither of them had planned and that had left, somewhere in the station's broadcast archive. A moment that was already being watched and would keep being watched. The frozen handshake, the frozen expression, the catering bot's impeccable timing. Saraval had walked toward him in that council with purpose. She still had it. It had simply found a better room. She drank from the cup. It tasted nothing like anything she knew. It was warm, and the shape of it was right for holding. And across the table the human negotiator was opening the first working document on his datapad, with the quiet, unhurried manner of a man who understood that the most important agreements were never the ones you rushed. She set down her cup, she looked at the document, she began.